All right. Welcome once again. We are starting a few minutes late, but we are going live and we are being recorded. So you'll be able to see this on the ALC channel and then shortly thereafter on the Francis Schaeffer Study Center channel. So thank you for your patience. But we're starting a fall lecture series, and I've picked three figures from my favorite period of history, from the Reformation. Erasmus at the very beginning, and then Calvin. I did Luther last year. Figure out of equal time, all fairness, we ought to do Calvin. My wife is not sure she'll come to that lecture, but that's okay. And then we'll do Beza, whom nobody has heard of, but he is Calvin's successor in Geneva, and he has quite an interesting career of his own. But tonight I'm going to talk about Desiderius Erasmus. And I teased this on Sunday at church by telling you the aphorism that was actually already circulating during his lifetime, which is that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. And then there's a lot of truth contained in that little saying. So he complained, by the way, about both of these portraits on the left and the right, because he says, that's not Erasmus. Erasmus never works sitting down. He's always standing up. So he did like the one in the middle, somewhat. All right, so about the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, which is the name associated with this lecture series. Founded in 2004, our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art, and it is named for the influential theologian and apologist Francis Schaeffer. 1912 to 1984, which is looking more and more like ancient history. I have to introduce him to my students these days because not all of them know who he is. In addition to sponsoring these public lectures, the Schaeffer Study Center offers a high school program which is built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization. We take all of our students through Western Civ from the ancient world to the modern world over the course of 4 years. 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. They get 3 hours a week of live classroom instruction, an hour with the historian, that would be me, an hour with the literary analyst, that would be my wife, Cindy, and an hour with one of our 2 art historians. So it's an integrated look at the history, the literature, and the art of each of the civilizations and each of the time periods in Western civilization. And our students have much to our gratification, reported back, because we've been doing this for 18 years now? I thought we got to 17 a year or two ago. Our students have gone on to study at all the Tennessee universities, at Vanderbilt, at Belmont, at Austin Peay, Covenant College, Bryan College, and we've had one student who got an appointment to the Air Force Academy. And they all report back that what they learned in 4 years here with us gave them an incredible foundation, and they were able to go on to advanced coursework at all of their institutions there. So very, very happy. Here's me. My lovely wife and I have been married for 48 years. We have 12 children and 22 grandchildren so far. My background is as a historian. I'm an undergraduate major, and my master's are both in history. I've been a teacher, an author, a college professor. I was actually city manager here in Mount Juliet for 7 years. Don't ask me how that happened. We have a publishing company, and with my wife, we are co-directors of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. So the standard starting question I ask every time I do a lecture, what's the most significant thing you already know about Erasmus, assuming you know something?
He was born out of wedlock. Use it.
I'm sorry?
Translated back in the original Greek so it could be used to create translation.
Yes, he is a Greek scholar, one of the best in the world at the time he was alive. I've already teased you a bit with the connection to Luther. He's about 15 or 16 years older than Luther. So he's famous when Luther is unknown. He's famous when Luther starts to making waves. In fact, he might be one of the most famous men in Europe. And he is, in fact, the first author to have made money from publishing his books. Now, that wasn't the only source of income. He did get some support from patrons, and he did get a nice cushy job as an advisor to the emperor, which paid him the equivalent of about $100,000 a year when he could collect it, which was not always. They were always kind of behind in their payments to him. But he made a considerable amount of money from the books that he had published, and I'll talk about the economics of that later on. He's also a bit of a puzzle. And I've read a couple of biographies recently. This is actually a 19th century biography of him, and in his preface, this really struck me. At every stage of the study of Erasmus, one has to ask first what he believed himself to be doing, and then what he wished others to believe that he was doing, and then what others did think he was doing, and finally, what the man actually was doing. Because you could get 4 different answers. His life was full of strange incongruities. And that's from a biographer, a professor in New England, who spent a considerable amount of time on him. Probably the most famous biography of him is by Roland Bainton. And if you're of my generation, then you may remember the biography he did of Martin Luther, which was actually published back in the 50s, called Here I Stand, and was a popular bestseller. He's a professional historian as well. But he then went on to do a biography of Erasmus, and his quote at the beginning of that is, "No man in Europe had so many friends in high places, in church, state, and school. He seemed to have met and become friends with everybody. He was a friend of King Henry VIII. He was a friend of King Francis of France. He was a friend of several popes. He was a friend of cardinals. He was a friend of princes. He held university positions. He taught at Cambridge for 5 years. He taught at the University of Louvain for 5 years. He's everywhere, and he writes to everybody. And he saved copies of all his letters. So we have an impressive amount of material. Now, we know almost everything about him by what he said about what he was doing. So you just have to take that with a grain of salt. The collected works of Erasmus, University of Toronto, Canada, is producing these. They're still producing them. They're projecting a total of 89 or 90 volumes by the time they're done, and they're translating everything into English. So this is 67 volumes of his books and his letters and his diaries, and they're in English. They're still coming out. They actually published one last year. They think there'll be another 20 or so before they're done exhausting the material. So there is a wealth of material available about his life, but it's all filtered through him. The biographies, I mentioned the Emerson, I gave you the quote from Emerson, 1898. It's still an excellent biography. I brought my copy because I have annotated it. Yes, it's still in print. It's been brought back in print by a company called Regimen Books. So I was very pleased to find that you can still get this one. Ephraim Emerson. There is one by a Dutch historian, because Erasmus is Dutch. He's a cosmopolitan man of the world, but he's originally known as, although this is one of the weirdest reprints I've run across in recent memory. This is a reprint of what was a book like about this size, and it's got all the text, but I think I'd go blind. Trying to read, it's like, whoever designed this book should be taken out and have their computer access permanently banned. But Huizinga does a very good job because as a Dutch historian, he's able to set Erasmus in his context better than almost. And of course, he titles his book Erasmus and the Age of Reformation. Ephraim is Erasmus of Rotterdam. Bainton is Erasmus of Christendom. And this one's also come back in print. So I can recommend that one as well. And then I don't have a copy of the Tracy. I read it when I was earlier in Incarnation teaching the Reformation as a historian, Erasmus of the Low Countries. His is the longest, and I found it a little bit tedious. It's more detailed than I really wanted or needed. But it does have the advantage that he's able to take advantage of the University of Toronto scholarship. So he had access to more materials than either Emerton, Huizinga, or Bainton. But we can get the general outline. And I'm not going to go into the level of detail where what I'm going to talk about tonight would make a lot of difference. So here's an outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about his childhood, his education, how he became a monk, how he became a priest, and his early professional career. He winds up leaving the monastery and becoming secretary to the Bishop of Cambrai, and then goes to Paris, and then makes a visit to England, and comes back to Paris. He's in Paris ostensibly studying for his doctorate, which seems to be taking him forever. He seems to be doing everything except working on his doctorate. He's reading, he's traveling, he's meeting people, he's going to the court with the king, but yeah, so he's the typical graduate student. Then he spends 5 years in Italy, works in Venice with one of the most famous printers there, and his first major academic scholarly works are published then. Comes back and spends 5 years as a professor in England at the University of Cambridge. Leaves there and goes to Louvain, which is actually now, I think, it's in Belgium now, but it would have been the Netherlands generally at that time. It's a very prestigious university. And he's there for 7 years, 1521. And then he has to leave because he's accused of being a Lutheran. And they're burning Luther's books. And he says, if they're burning Luther's books and they're accusing me of being a Lutheran, I might want to get out of Dodge. And so he does. He goes to Basel. He had been working with a printer in Basel for the previous 7 or 8 years. He lives there for 8 years. And then Basel is forcibly converted to the Lutheran cause, and they are whitewashing churches and smashing idols, and they're accusing him of being a supporter of the Pope. And so he leaves Basel and goes about 50 miles away to Freiburg, which is an imperial city just down the Rhine, but it's Catholic. So he winds up the last few years of his life in Freiburg. He only comes back to Basel at the end in 1536 and is there for less than a year when he dies. So, and there's this, I'm not quite sure how to read that. I think if I studied it long enough, I could make some sense of it, but this is like a stylized subway map of all the places he went and how he got from one place to another and where he lived, and I'm not going to spend time trying to decipher it. Okay, we're not sure when he was born, because he himself gave several different dates, depending on what stage in his life he was in. And different cities claim him and have honored the anniversary of his birth in different years. So, 1566 is the earliest date. 1569 is a possible date. We're not quite sure, and there's a reason we're not quite sure. He was born out of wedlock. His mother and father were perhaps young. When his mother got pregnant, his father fled to Rome, and somebody sent him word that his mother had died, and so he entered the Roman Catholic Church and took orders as a priest, which of course means a lifelong vow of celibacy. So then he finally comes back and discovers she hadn't died, she's alive, but he's a priest, so he can't legally marry her, but they did in fact form a household, and he lived with her and helped him care for their son, who was Erasmus. But as an illegitimate offspring of a man who was now, he wasn't a priest when he was conceived and born, but he was a priest when he came back from Italy, and that actually barred Erasmus from holding offices in the church. He could become a monk, but he wasn't really eligible to be ordained or to hold any office in any church or cathedral chapter, or certainly not to be an official. And that was both embarrassing and an obstacle to what became later his career. But so he grows up until he's about 12 or 13. He's living with his father and mother in the Netherlands, not far from Rotterdam. They moved to Gouda at one point. No jokes, please. And then at 9, he was sent to a school in Deventer. It's one of the leading academies in the Netherlands. he apparently showed considerable academic ability as a young boy. They're beginning to teach him Latin when he's at grammar school age. That's why, by the way, why you went to grammar school was to learn Latin grammar. And the school in Deventer was one of the leading centers of classical education. It was run by the Brethren of the Common Life. He was taught classical Latin. He studied Roman classical authors. And the Brethren of the Common Life were a different kind of monastic order. You didn't take a lifelong perpetual vow. You were free to leave anytime you wanted. And they devoted themselves to establishing schools and caring for orphans. And their schools became famous. Luther studied at a school run by the Brethren of the Common Life 15 years later in Germany. So it was a lay piety movement. It was quite popular and very, very well respected. And the school at Deventer was their leading school in the Low Countries. Thomas à Kempis, whom some of you might have heard of, wrote a book that's still in print and still read called The Imitation of Christ, which emphasizes not a theological critique of what the church teaches or the decrees and councils and theological systems. It just teaches simple lay piety. We should try to be as much like Jesus as we can be. And Thomas à Kempis became sort of the patron of the Brethren of the Common Life. They adopted his attitude on things, and Erasmus would have become acquainted with his writings very early on. So he's born into an age which is undergoing the rapid transition from hand-copied manuscript books to read to printed books. Books start to be printed in 1455. He's born 10 years after Gutenberg prints the first edition of the Bible. So all around him, the manuscripts created by hand by monks copying them out laboriously are being increasingly every year replaced by printed books. So he is of the book age. At 14, an outbreak of the plague killed his father and his mother and 20 students at the school. So he's an orphan and not quite penniless, but almost. There was some small bequest from his father, but apparently one of the teachers at another school was supposed to be his guardian and administer, and the money just kind of frittered away. He wanted to go to university. And his guardian said, there's no money for you to go to university. And he was then strongly urged by his teachers at the school and by his guardian to enter a monastery and take the vows of a monk. And he apparently resisted, didn't want to do that, didn't see that he was cut out for that life, but was sort of told, you have no other options. Your parents have died. The money they left behind is exhausted. You don't have the money to go to university. The best thing you can do is join a monastery. At 15 or 16, you're too old to be an orphan taken in as a foster child by somebody. Go join the monks. So he found an Augustinian monastery not too far away, and he became an Augustinian monk. It's the same order of monks that Luther later joined. So he's an Augustinian monk in his late teens now. And yeah, there we go. So yeah, born in Gouda, but he always identified his birthplace as Rotterdam because I think it's a little more prestigious. He moved to Deventer and then to Stein. And then he'd only been a couple of years at the monastery, and he really didn't like it. In fact, he complained for the rest of his life. He said, among other things, I didn't get enough sleep, and the food was terrible. And I'm not cut out for this life. So the prior of the monastery actually recognized his intellectual ability. He's still only around 20, 21, and recommended him to a bishop in Cambrai as a personal secretary and gave him permission to leave the monastery and go be secretary to the bishop. There's some indication that that bishop might have had ambitions and was contemplating moving to Rome himself and seeking advancement in the church. He never did, but Erasmus left the monastery, sort of given a temporary leave of absence. You can go be secretary to this bishop because you're good with words. You have a nice handwriting style. And after only a year as secretary to the bishop, he asked for and got permission to go to Paris to university, fulfilling what had been his desire for a number of years. And to study for a doctorate. So Yeah. 3 years later, he's ordained as a priest. Oh, here we go. I got that map out of order. Sorry. Left the monastic life. He never returned to the monastery. That was it. When he left in his early 20s, he never went back into a monastery. He went to the Sorbonne in Paris. And after several years of study at Paris, but I've said he was kind of, free, young man, no family, he's pursuing his intellectual interests, but they are very, very wide. He is reading every ancient author he can get his hands on. He is already showing an interest in the ancient languages, especially Greek. And while he's there, an English nobleman, William Blount, Lord Montjoy, he has a title, recruited him to be his tutor and to teach him Latin and Greek. And 1499, he invited him to go to England for a visit with him. He visited both London and Oxford. And while he's there, let's see, there we go. He befriended some of the leading Greek scholars in England. Erasmus has this knack of finding the important people and introducing himself and befriending them. And he's apparently a very charming, likable young man and very smart, but not in a way that rubs them the wrong way, in a way that impresses them. So Thomas Linacre, William Grocyn, William Lilly, John Cole, these are the leading Greek scholars at Cambridge. These are the ones, and Greek is the hot new language that has just been rediscovered. The first grammars and the first Greek texts of the ancient authors are being published. Everything had been in Latin through the Middle Ages. He also befriended a young law student in London who was debating entering an Augustinian monastery, there's that order of monks again, who happened to be named Thomas More. And More eventually decided not to become a monk, but instead to study the law and become a lawyer. But he and Erasmus became very good friends during this short visit. He returned to Paris after this visit of only a few months and worked on 3 projects. He was really made much more enthusiastic about mastering the Greek language. He knew the Latin authors that he admired the most had all read the Greek authors, and he couldn't read Greek. In fact, there weren't any universities until about 1500 that actually taught Greek. So he's like, okay, there's some scholars who are figuring it out. I want to know what they know. I want to read what they're reading. I want to read Plato and Aristotle in the Greek, which nobody has done for quite a while. He also starts, for his own use, a collection of adages or proverbs or sayings. And it's so he can include references and quotations when he's writing something. When he's writing a letter or when he's writing an essay, he has a little quotation book. And he starts writing little annotations about where he has seen this quotation used. Not just the first one to use it, but how have other authors in the ancient world. He is reading so widely that his annotations grow to become almost essays for each of the quotes in his quote book. It's for his personal use at first. The first published book that he creates is called The Manual of a Christian Knight, 1503. He's just turned 30. He's been a student now for about 7 or 8 years. And his skill in rhetoric has grown. And one of the parish publishers takes one of his essays and agrees to print it, and he enjoys some success. And that book is still being read, The Manual of the Christian Knight. It's very much like Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ. So if you want to be a Christian, you should model what you do in your life after the way Jesus lived. So now he's kind of beginning to be established as an intellectual and as an author. Makes a second visit to England, a little bit longer one this time, 1505, 1506, and he stays with Thomas More in London, who's now completed his legal studies and has been elected to Parliament. So 1505, 1506, the King of England is still Henry VII. Henry VIII is a prince. He's a young man, and he's showing quite a bit of promise. As a scholar himself, he's reading and writing classical Latin, and he wants to learn Greek. And, of course, Erasmus befriends him while he's still a prince. They exchange letters back and forth, and Henry VIII counts Erasmus as a friend, as does Thomas More. Henry VII, of course, is the winner of the War of the Roses. He's the one who killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He's been King of England since 1483, so about 20 years now. But his son, his oldest surviving son, is poised to be the next king, and Erasmus has become his friend. So there we have his second time in his somewhat longer stay in London and Cambridge. And so during that stay, he spends some time at court because he's friends with the prince. And among the people he meets at court is the Italian physician to the king, Dr. Boero, or Boerio. And Dr. Boerio has two sons, and he wants to send them back to Italy for university education. And he decides that Erasmus is the right guy to go as guardian and tutor and director for his two sons when they go back to university. They're probably 16 years old, 16, 15, so mid to late teens. So he gets to make his first trip to Italy. And he's got a little money, and he's got an appointment by someone who's in the English court, and he's going to visit the Italian universities. So, yeah, this is going to be an opportunity for him as well. And yes, early on in the trip, we're not quite sure how the connections worked, but he's visiting Turin in northern Italy, and the university there awards him his doctorate. He didn't complete it in Paris. In fact, there's questions over whether he ever really completed anything or not. But they apparently accepted the Enchiridion, and he was already preparing his quote book for publication. And they looked over his collection. It had now grown to 800 quotations and over 1,000 pages. And they said, oh yes, we'll name you Dr. Erasmus. He also got a dispensation from the Pope, which removed the impediment of his defective birth, which allowed him then to be appointed to church offices, because the Pope can do that. Again, we're not quite sure of the details, because all we have to go on is Erasmus's own accounts of these events, and he doesn't tell us how he managed to arrange for these things. We just know that it did happen. There are records that show he was awarded the doctorate, and he got this dispensation from the Pope. He visits Florence, he visits Rome. He's just agog at the resources, the scholarly resources that he's introduced to the papal librarian. He sees the collection of manuscripts in the Vatican Library. He's allowed to make some copies and add to his little quote book. And they suggest to him that that quote book probably could and should be published, and it would be a useful resource for lots of scholars around Europe. And the best publishing house to handle that kind of publication would be in Venice. Aldus Manutius had already built a huge reputation by 1508 for his publication of classic works from the ancient world, and he had a distribution network that went all throughout Europe. And Erasmus showed up with a letter of introduction from the Pope, and Manutius brought him into his household, and they worked together on a much expanded edition of the Adages. I think I've got... Yeah. So this is only about 200 of them, translated into English. When Manutius published one, I think there were 800. Oh, no, sorry. There had been an edition published in Paris. It was 800. With Manutius, he expanded the count to 3,260 adages. And for each of these adages, he gives you a Latin source, and then our English translator gives us an English translation. And then he starts going through all the different ancient sources who had quoted these, and he's like on a name-dropping binge. He's like, well, Aristotle uses it this way, and Euripides says this, and Plato has it in this dialogue, and then, of course, Seneca and Cicero use the adage as well in these essays. And he's not really, I don't think, it doesn't seem, at least in this translation, like he's showing off. But you read it and you just kind of are agog. It's like, this guy has read everything and he remembers everything. He's either made incredible notes or he's just got an incredible mind. because he quotes all of these different authors. And this is the book that really brings him to the attention of the university world, the professor world, the intellectual world. Being published by Aldus Manutius is a mark of prestige in and of itself, because Manutius is very picky about who he publishes and what he publishes. But then people start reading it and they go, oh my gosh, this guy is brilliant. He's a genius. He understands languages, and he's read everybody in the ancient world. So Erasmus is now, he's, by the way, delivered the two sons of the physician to Henry VII. They're enrolled at university. He's freed from his obligation. Now he's off on his own projects. He lived in Venice with Manutius in his household for 2 years. And in there are about 30 people living in Manutius' household. Some of them go on to be cardinals. Some of them go on, they're noblemen from France and England and Germany. And Erasmus is just making these connections that he will then use for the rest of his life. Cardinal Aleander was his roommate. He's not a cardinal yet. He's just a young university student and a priest. He's eventually a cardinal, and he's the one that the Pope sends to deal with Luther in Germany. And he and Erasmus were roommates in Manutius' house. Mind-boggling. So here we go. Yeah, here's his trip from Paris to Turin, and then down to Florence and Rome, and then back up to Venice, where he lives for several years. And his reputation spreads and spreads and grows and grows. Now, in 1509, Henry VII died, King of England, the victor of Bosworth Field. He apparently killed Richard III in personal combat on the battlefield. And so his young son, who is not the fat guy with 6 wives, okay, in 1509, he is the young, dashing Renaissance prince. He has been given the education of a humanist. He is friends with Thomas More and the professors at Cambridge. He has written a theological work of his own. And he's friends with Erasmus. And so the circle of professors that Erasmus knows in England write to him and say, hey, Prince Henry is now King Henry. You should come to London. It's going to be a golden age. And so that's what he does. He leaves Italy for England, 1510. Along the way, he's going back to visit first in London his friend Thomas More, and along the way, somewhere between Venice and London, he composes a little satirical essay called The Praise of Folly, In Cominium Morii, which is a pun on Thomas More's name. It can also be read In Praise of More. But it's in praise of, the Greek word morii is foolishness or folly. And it is a rip-roaring satire. It's an after-dinner speech, actually more than that. It's a stand-up comedy routine. He writes in the voice of Folly. And he has her, the framing of it is he has Lady Folly herself. So you have Lady Wisdom in the book of Proverbs. He creates Lady Folly and has her stand up after a banquet and start speaking to the crowd and saying, you know what? Everybody thinks wisdom is all that. She's not all that. I'm all that. None of you would be here were it not for folly. He said, none of you gets married without a big dose of folly. None of you conceives children without a big dose of folly. He says, I'm really the one that's responsible for everything good that's ever happened to you. And you can find me and my effects amongst all the different nations of Europe and in all the different occupations. Let me tell you who are the most foolish. The schoolmasters are foolish. The theologians are foolish. Don't even let me get started on the monks and the nuns. They're the most superstitious. And he goes on. It's about 150 pages of nothing but, it's a Don Rickles routine. He's insulting the Scots for their food and their dress. He's insulting the French for their preoccupation with culture and their noses in the air. He's insulting the Germans because they do nothing but drink beer and eat sausages. He's just, he doesn't spare anybody. But then 2/3 of the way through that book, this is where it gets interesting. He flips. He turns the whole, he's got the whole audience laughing. And if you're reading it and you get what he's doing, you have to laugh. And then he says, and you know what? Christians have to be willing to be fools. There is the folly of the gospel. The philosophy of the Greeks, they treat the gospel as foolishness, and it is. We have to be willing to be fools for Christ. And he spends the last third of this 150-page little essay extolling the simple life that follows. And you see the influence of Thomas à Kempis and his own writing on the Handbook of a Christian Knight. And he dedicates it, of course, to Sir Thomas More. And this makes him even more famous. When this comes out, everybody wants a copy of it for whatever reason. Some of them buy it probably because he is satirizing and making fun of all the right people. If you don't like monks or professors or Frenchmen or Italians or Scots or Germans, then there's something in here that'll make you laugh. But then if you read it to the end, he slips some very interesting stuff in. So this adds to his reputation. He gets to England. He's appointed Cambridge professor, lets him all of a sudden get into the circle of Greek scholars again and improve his knowledge of that language. He's teaching it to undergraduates. He's researching the early church fathers, especially Jerome. He has become fascinated with Jerome, who did the translation of the New Testament books from Greek into Latin. And Jerome's translation of all the New Testament books into Latin had become the standard Bible of the medieval world. And it wasn't intended to be a way to remove the Bible from access by ordinary people. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, he was translating it for all of the population of the empire in the West. Greek was spoken in the East, but not in the West. The citizens of Italy and Gaul and Hispania and England, they all spoke Latin. They didn't read or write or talk Greek. So he is taking the scriptures and putting them in the language that they can understand. Well, Erasmus becomes fascinated with Jerome because Jerome writes a pretty good Latin. He clearly understands Greek. He actually had moved to Bethlehem in the Holy Land, which is where he completes his translation work. He reads and writes Hebrew, which is something Erasmus wanted to do but hadn't gotten around to learning. He's had been up to here with mastering classical Latin and mastering ancient Greek. So he is tutored in Greek privately by some of the professors, and he's working on Jerome, and he decides that he will do a new Latin translation from the Greek texts of the New Testament books. Because there are some Greek manuscripts available, not very many. But he will go back to the Greek, now that he's learned that language, and he will do a new translation into Latin because he knows enough now about Jerome and about his translation to say, Jerome doesn't always understand the Greek as well as he should. There are places where Jerome translates something from Greek into Latin, and I don't think he's got it quite right. And so he wants to do a new translation. He's working on all of this while he's in England. Yeah, that's the map of him getting back to England from Venice. Okay. He leaves Cambridge because he gets an appointment at a university back sort of in his hometown, back in the Netherlands, Louvain. And over the next 7 years, he is everywhere in the Low Countries. We have letters collected that he sent because he keeps a copy of every letter he sends. They're dated and written from Louvain, from Antwerp, from Brussels, from Bruges, from Anderlecht, from St. Omer. He's everywhere. And he makes trips to England and to Basel. He's got a new printer north of the Alps. So Manutius in Venice is a little bit of a hike from Louvain, but you can go up the Rhine to the northern side of the Alps, and Basel is where the Rhine makes its little 90-degree bend. And there is a printing house there that's beginning to rival Manutius, Johann Froben. So he's starting to make visits to Basel, working with Johann Froben, who's kind of taken him under his wing much the same way Manutius did. It's like, oh yeah, I know the books that Manutius did with you made him a lot of money. If you'll do some books with me, I can make a lot of money and you'll make a lot of money. So he's learning how the whole printing and book selling business works, and he is insisting that he get compensated for the books. So he makes trips. These are all brief trips of just a few months, but 1514, 1515, 1516, 1518. We know he goes to Basel to visit with the printer and to work on the printing projects. His longest residence is at Louvain, where he's a professor and very well respected. He actually is appointed a counselor to Charles, the Lord of the Netherlands and Count of Burgundy, with an annual salary of $100,000 a year, if they'd only paid it. He has a wealthy patron with a small fortune and no heir. And the patron wants to leave his fortune to Erasmus, and Erasmus says, no, I have another idea. I want you to endow the University of Louvain for a new college within the university that is dedicated to research and teaching the three languages, the Collegium Trilingue, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. It's very, very interesting. It's like creating a think tank inside a university, and he has the financial backing to do it. So it's really become something of his passion at this point. So he's in Louvain, which is between Cambrai and Liège, and then the blue dash lines are he's going back and forth to Basel. And then in 1516, he has two new scholarly works published in Basel by his new printer, Froben, and they make him famous. The first is the New Testament, carefully revised and corrected by Erasmus of Rotterdam. And the second is the Life of Jerome and 8 collected volumes of his letters, both of which he has worked on. And these are actually, there are about 10 copies of that New Testament that are now in libraries in Europe. This is actually from one in Dusseldorf, and I'm dying to get a reprint of one of these things. I haven't found a decent one yet, but they have theirs online. So this is full size. This is the first page of the Gospel, the Evangelium Secundum Mattheum. So the Gospel according to Matthew. And here's Erasmus's new classical Latin translation in this column. And here's the Greek text. And the typography on this is just exquisite. I mean, Froben was one of the better printers in the world at this time. The published book, it's folio size. So this is the size of it. It would have been a large book. It's 600 pages. And it's every book of the New Testament with the Greek text and Erasmus. And then actually only about 400 pages are the Greek and Latin text. The other 200 are Erasmus's annotations and his commentary and his corrections to Jerome. Jerome says this, but I think this is a better Latin understanding of the Greek. They only printed 1,200 copies because it's a very specialized academic kind of book. The audience for this is university professors, and really only university professors teaching Greek and Latin. Sold out. The book was, if you translated the cost of the book, 2 gulden. Well, 2 gulden is actually probably be out somewhere between a month and 2 months' wages for your average worker. This is probably something like $500 for this book if you translate it to 21st century monetary terms. It sold out. They reprinted it the next year, and the next, and the next, and each time longer print runs. They can't keep this thing. And Erasmus is, because I mean, he's making money, but B, this also makes his reputation. Nobody else had done this. There were no printed copies. If you wanted to read the Greek, you had to go find a Greek manuscript in a monastery somewhere that had been hand copied. This is the first time the Greek text was available. This Greek text that Erasmus published is essentially the text that the King James Bible is translated from. This Erasmus's text is called the Textus Receptus. Now, it has some advantages and some disadvantages. He had 5 or 6 manuscripts that he compared to try and get the best reading and the oldest reading. But there's some limitations in that. Among other things, he couldn't find a complete manuscript that had every chapter of the book of Revelation. He's missing about the last dozen verses of the book of Revelation. Now, Jerome had all of Revelation in Latin, so Erasmus did kind of a neat trick because he's setting it up for the typesetters. He translates Jerome's Latin back into Greek and then includes it. And eventually, of course, somebody finds a complete copy of the text of Revelation, and Erasmus's Greek does not look anything like what John's Greek was for those last dozen verses. The crazy thing is, it's Erasmus's Greek that gets translated by the King James Committee. Here's, after you get past the really nice, ornate, decorated page, because the colors there are added by hand, here's what a printed page for most of the book looks like. But again, it's always 2 columns. The Greek column, and those Greek letters are just amazing. And you see how far printing has come. This is only 50 years after Gutenberg. So this is like the internet going from dial-up to fiber. And like I say, one of these days, I'm hoping I'll be able to, maybe a page will pop up somewhere, who knows? I keep looking at the auction catalogs. The population was a bombshell. Its impact cannot be overestimated. This just set off Europe, set off the intellectual centers of Europe. All the professors of theology wanted a copy of this. First print run sold out quickly. Subsequent print runs, larger and larger numbers, all sold out. $300 to $500. Professor Dr. Martin Luther acquired a copy within 6 months of it being published. We know because we have his lecture notes. We have the notes where he's lecturing on the book of Romans, and he starts quoting from Erasmus in the margins and quoting the Greek text. And of course, the next year, the year after Erasmus does this, Luther decides this whole bit of selling indulgences just doesn't fit anywhere with the New Testament, and so he writes out the 95 Theses and tacks them up on the bulletin board. And he is nobody. He's a university professor, but he's at one of the smaller second or third tier universities. He is not the cosmopolitan figure that Erasmus is. He's been out of Saxony precisely once in his life. His monastic order sent him on business to Rome, and he was there for a couple of weeks and came home appalled. Erasmus has been everywhere, and Erasmus has been published by the 2 largest publishing houses in Europe, the 2 most prestigious. Who is this little monk in Germany? Well, he's reading your book, and he's drawing conclusions. When Luther starts to get into trouble, he doesn't immediately get into trouble, but he starts getting in trouble. He's not tried before the emperor until 1521. In between the posting of the 95 Theses, somebody sends a copy to Erasmus, so he kind of knows what's going on. He's scratching his head going, who is this guy? Who is this kid? And he writes letters to friends defending Luther, saying, he's satirizing the sale of indulgences. Well, have you read In Praise of Folly? So did I. I wrote satirical bits about all the superstitions and over relics, and he's just doing what I did, although he's sometimes a little earthier. But at his own university in Louvain, he gets denounced as a heretic. They're burning Luther's books, and they say, and Erasmus is a Lutheran. He's like, oh, this is not good. Because he's not sure he wants to go as far as Luther is going in terms of what his intentions are to change the church. After Luther's excommunication by the Pope and his condemnation at Worms in 1521, Erasmus criticized both actions as ferocious and wrong. You shouldn't have excommunicated him. You shouldn't have made him an outlaw. But I'm not sure I agree with everything he wrote. He leaves the University of Louvain. He moves permanently to Basel because it's safer. He's not going to be threatened there. In January of 1522, a year after he makes that move from Louvain to Basel, Adrian of Utrecht, who had been a colleague with him at Louvain. He had been on the faculty. They knew each other. He's elected Pope. When Pope Leo dies, Adrian of Utrecht, that's where he's from, but he's a theology professor who's become a bishop and a cardinal and is a friend of Erasmus. And he writes Erasmus and says, please come to Rome and help me. Erasmus is in Basel and he thinks about it, but then he writes one and says, I don't think I can do that because if I come, the Lutherans will denounce me, A. And B, if I come to help you try and reform the church and deal with the abuses that Luther has pointed out quite rightly, he says, what will happen to me if you die? He said, I will find myself in Rome, and there'll probably be a swing of the pendulum back the other way, and I'll be in huge trouble. So I will stay in Basel. Thank you very much. But I'm not going to go Jonah Luther either. In 1524, Erasmus had Froben publish his essay called On Free Will, because his Catholic friends, people in the church are saying, you gotta point out some of Luther's errors. So he does take issue directly, names Luther, and says, I don't think Luther is right about free will. So he writes an essay on free will. And about a year and a half later, Luther publishes his answer, which is called The Bondage of the Will, where he proves that he is rhetorically the equal of Erasmus and almost certainly a better theologian. Luther cites Augustine and the church fathers in support of the fact that our will since the fall is in bondage to sin, and free will does not include the ability to freely choose to follow God based on your own choice. We only choose to follow God if the Holy Spirit enables us. And Erasmus had written a key line, Erasmus being Erasmus. He had said, I don't know all of the deep theological questions. I don't have answers to all the deep theological controversies. He says, where the scriptures don't speak, I would prefer to remain a skeptic. And Luther writes back and says, my dear brother Erasmus, the Holy Spirit is not a skeptic. There are things that scriptures plainly teach in which you should affirm, and you're a coward. They never really got along after that. Yeah. 1529, Lutherans win control of the Basel City Council. The Mass is abolished. Statues of saints are removed from the churches. Erasmus left for Catholic Freiburg, 50 miles down the Rhine, and spends the last 5 or 6 years of his life there until the very end when he does come back to Basel for a year. The Adagiorum Collectania, there we go, the adages. The Enchiridion, the thousands of adages, that's what Agiorum Chiliadis means, thousands of adages, over 3,000. Praise of Folly, New Testament, Education of a Christian Prince. He dips his pen into satire again in 1518 with the Colloquies, which are just ferociously funny, but they get banned by the theology faculty in Paris. Free will, etc. There's a very interesting quote from him on Luther before he died. He returns to Basel and dies a year later. Luther died 10 years after Erasmus. But before he died, Erasmus had written to Melanchthon, who is Luther's assistant at Wittenberg, and said, he says, I don't agree with everything Luther has written, and I certainly don't agree with his tone and his style. But it seems to me God has sent in this latter age a violent physician on account of the magnitude of the existing disorders. And Melanchthon quotes Erasmus in his funeral oration for Luther. That's the quote. In this latter age, God has sent a violent physician because this was how sick the church was. It is what we needed. Erasmus never left the Catholic Church, but he wouldn't go to Rome. They offered him a position as a bishop. They offered to appoint him as a bishop and possibly a cardinal, and he said, no, thank you. I'm doing quite well here. I would prefer to be on the university at Louvain, but obviously that's not safe for me. But I'm quite comfortable working with the publishers and doing my writing and research here in Basel. Until Basel went a little bit nuts. And that kind of gets me to the end. Now, we're going to pick this up because there is an interesting overlap. When he comes back to Basel in 1536, there's a young French refugee, also a university graduate from the University of Paris, who's dropped out and fled because of persecution. He arrives in Basel in 1536, and he's working not with Froben, because he's not very well known yet. He's working with another more smaller printing house to publish a little 100-page pamphlet called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And it's published in Basel the year that Erasmus dies there. And we don't have any record that the two ever met. They were probably running in completely different circles. Calvin was actually living in Basel under an assumed name, not even under Jean Calvin, which is his real given name. He's French, Jean Calvin. But he's not even using that name. And Erasmus, of course, is the friend of princes and the wealthy and has patrons. And so it's the most likely scenario is that their paths never really crossed. But to me, it's just intriguing that they're both there, that their lives overlap for a year. The last year of Erasmus' life, and Calvin is polishing his essay. And the first edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion is only 100 pages. Calvin kept revising and enlarging it until it was 5 volumes. But the first edition is 100 pages. So we'll talk about him next month. I hope that's helpful. Anybody got questions or comments or something that you saw or something that you wanted to get an answer to? I'll do my best. I've been reading biographies of Erasmus for the last couple of weeks.
Did he have a reaction to Thomas More's execution?
Thomas More was executed in 1536, same year. And he was friends with More and with Bishop Fisher. And yeah, he thought it. I mean, he was at the end of his life. He was in bad health. He got word that his friend in England had been executed, and yeah, there is some speculation that those experiences all at the same time kind of just broke him. That my friend, I mean, he had been a guest in More's house and had dedicated Praise of Folly to him, and Henry sent him to the chopping block. So yeah, it's the circumstances are tragic. So you have Luther, you have Calvin, you have More and Fisher being executed because they won't sign the oath that acknowledges Henry as the head of the church, and they lose their lives because of their refusal to sign the supremacy oath. And More had been chancellor. Yeah, there are a couple published editions where they publish both. Yeah, that was one of my textbooks when I was in college.
I read it
Yeah.
a while back.
Yeah, it's a published edition that has both essays, the essay by Erasmus and the essay by Luther. In fact, the online school where I teach assigns it to, I think it's probably too early to give it to them, but they assign it to the 8th graders to read. Now, I teach the 11th graders, and we read Praise of Folly. And I have a great time because I do a stand-up reading of parts of it, and I do my best Monty Python little old lady voice, because that's the way it needs to be delivered. It's folly. You're all foolish.
Delved into, in fact, he was called a humanist.
Yes.
Free will, and the debate whether or not he was Pelagius.
Oh, Pelagian. Yeah. Does he believe that one can be saved by works? He actually, the theological position, and he does have a doctorate in theology. The theological position at the universities at that time was that man cannot by his own good works achieve his salvation. But there are some things that one can do. And the things that one can do, one must do in order to receive grace from God that accomplishes your salvation. So it's a concept, doing that which is within you. And Luther was taught that theology as well. Luther said, no, I think that's wrong. We are dead in our sins, and we need the Holy Spirit to give us faith to allow us to come to salvation. Yeah, it's a synergy. Yeah. It's not because Pelagius straight up, at least according to Augustine, Pelagius straight up taught that everybody was born innocent and that you could live a life of your own free will and by your own power. You could live without sinning. And of course, Augustine said, no, that's not possible. Luther says, no, that's not possible. Erasmus would agree. Oh, I agree. You can't live a sinless life. It's not possible. You can't merit your own salvation. But, and this is the theological position in late medieval theology faculties, you can do some things. You can make some acts of obedience and conformity to the law. And the things that you can do, you must do, or God will not meet you with the saving grace. So there's a Latin phrase for it called facientibus quod in se est, doing that which is in you. And Luther rejects that. He says, you're saved by faith alone, not by works, lest any man should boast. Because Luther goes back to the Greek text of the book of Ephesians. And he says, and Erasmus gave it to him. So, thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
I hope you'll come back next month, and we'll talk about Calvin and where he fits into all of these streams.
Well, we'll be here if we're destined to be here.
Yes. Well, I suspect some of you are predestined to be here next month. Yeah. Oh, do I have 1566 somewhere?
You do. You were said between 1466, instead you said 1566, 1567, and 1578.
Oh, for his birthdays?
Yeah, you advanced it 100 years.
Yeah. No, he's older than Luther, not younger. Yeah. All right, I'll do that. Thank you. And lay the book.